Hello 40K fans. So, while all of this is going on, Cadia has fallen, the 40K story is moving on, and in a video over on beastof4.com for Backstagers, we have an episode where we're looking at the Xenos and their involvement in this whole storyline and plotline as it evolves. If you're interested in finding out a bit more, head on over to Beasts of War, join Backstage, and join us for some more 40K Charted.
Anime cyberpunk style meets skirmish combat in Infinity. Experience 8 high-tech factions and fight to control the human sphere at the Infinity Hub on beastofwar.com. It's time for 28mm World War II action. Will you recreate history or reshape it your way? On the Bolt Action Hub at beastofwar.com.
I'm Warren, a huge fan of tabletop games. But few games out there have a story so deep as Warhammer 40K. I'm setting out to explore this vast universe and the game with my trusty guide, AJ. So join us on Warhammer 40K Charted.
Hi guys, and welcome to 40K Charted, where I'm getting a true education in the world and the universe that is Warhammer 40,000. AJ, Slaanesh.
Yep, it's quite an important one for many different races in the 40K universe. It's actually the youngest god, but possibly the most powerful, just because of the way it was created in such a violent explosion. Mm-hmm. I know we've talked before, but how Slaanesh came about was actually caused by the Eldar. Mm-hmm. When the Eldar were first created, when the Eldar kind of first roamed the universe, they were actually a very powerful race. Probably a bit too powerful. They lived long lives. They basically had no equals. Mm-hmm. And while they started off very aware and very much with a drive to preserve the universe, they realized how powerful they were, and they started to let it get to their heads, and they started to excess a little bit too much. They started to enjoy the more dubious pastimes out there, and they basically started to kind of take it too far. Yeah. Way past 50 Shades of Grey, you know.
Way past 50 Shades of Grey.
Way past,
okay,
you know.
Yeah.
Way, you know. There's probably
so like about 50 million Shades of Grey that you were exploring there.
Yeah. You know, so I mean, they started to kind of just kill for pleasure. Mm-hmm. They didn't have any real respect for the rest of the universe, and they became just a debauched society. In many ways, very similar to what we see as the Dark Eldar now. Mm-hmm. The Dark Eldar kind of continued along that path.
But less powerful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what happened then is whenever we think about how the Chaos Gods are created, we think of all that energy, all that negativity, that desire for just wanton pleasure kind of created this massive collapse of their race. And in this violent explosion, unfortunately we don't know exactly what happened, but there was a violent explosion of psychic energy, and it ripped a massive rent in the divide between the Immaterium and real space, and that's how we ended up with what's known as the Eye of Terror.
Right, so it's an aftermath of the destruction or the change or whatever it was of the original Eldar race. Was it called the Eldar? Or?
They were the Eldar. Originally, they were kind of made up of what was essentially one race. Mm-hmm. But obviously, after this massive, what's known as the fall of the Eldar, they split off. So just before the fall, there was a group of Eldar called the Exodites, and they basically went into exile. So they kind of separated themselves. They realized, look, we kind of realized we've gone too far here. Mm-hmm. They separated themselves off, and they went into kind of the fringes of the galaxy. Yeah. They kind of moved right away. as far as they could from the kind of hub of the Eldar, which was the Crone Worlds. So they kind of tried to get away from it. Whenever the fall happened, then you had the kind of the Harlequins, and their kind of band, sort of piratical Eldar, kind of escaped into the Webway, and you also had the Dark Eldar. They kind of took flight to Cormaga, which was a realm within the Webway, and the kind of the rest of the Eldar tried to escape on their craft worlds. You know, kind of these massive spaceships that are essentially almost planets in their own right.
Yeah.
But they can travel. So where the Eye of Terror is actually located on these Crone Worlds. So around these Crone Worlds. So the worlds that are within the Eye of Terror, what are now demon worlds. Back in the day, they were the
original Eldar world.
They were the Eldar worlds.
So the Eye of Terror is the birthplace of Slaanesh, then.
Yeah, it's where it was created.
And I've asked before on all the others, but where does Slaanesh live? You know, it's
so Slaanesh, as you can imagine, lives in a palace of excess.
Lovely.
This kind of tangled web, basically.
It's like the Playboy Mansion, isn't it? Yeah.
It's Hugh Hefner taking off a few notches. Basically, what happened? What happens when you go to this palace of excess is much like Slaanesh. You go into a sort of almost like a kind of maze.
Yeah.
But this is more, rather than a physical maze, this is a maze where you're kind of exposed to all the pleasures that you might desire. I'll leave that to your imagination at home.
I can imagine a lot.
But basically what happens is, if you indulge yourself, if you allow yourself to indulge yourself, you become idle.
Which I would. You know?
It would be very hard not to. You would basically indulge yourself to death.
What a way to go.
There's worse ways.
Yeah.
But essentially, you become so idle that you don't consider your own...
You can't remember why you were there in the first place.
No, you don't know what, you know. So if you allow even that slightest temptation...
So it's a maze of the mind and the soul.
Yeah. If you succumb, your soul becomes Slaanesh's.
Slaanesh, is it the harvester of souls? Or?
It very much consumes the souls of those it kind of becomes master of.
And this is why the Eldar have soul stones, because they're terrified of Slaanesh eating their souls when they die. So they try to capture their souls.
Yeah.
So as not to let Slaanesh have them.
If an Eldar dies in a natural sort of way, or in battle or however, its soul is taken by Slaanesh. So unless the Eldar race preserve the creature's soul, then it will always go to Slaanesh. Which is why the Dark Eldar, although they don't have the stones so much, they just try and preserve their life as long as they physically can and feed off other mortals' souls. So that's why they take large amounts of slaves, because they want to actually feed off their...
So they feed off them to try and preserve their lives, whereas the Eldar have some kind of technology of some sort to almost encase it within these soul stones.
Yeah. And those stones are then used to kind of... The energy, because obviously the being's energy is still there, is used to kind of, almost in the way that a servitor is used in the Imperium, to kind of power things and to kind of man crew weapons and things like that there.
So the philosophy of Slaanesh is like taking pleasure to its extreme. It's like taking pleasure to its ultimate outcome. It is truly the embodiment of too much of a good thing. Yeah. So what about the demon princes, and how does Slaanesh manifest itself on the battlefield then?
So on the battlefield, obviously you've got your lesser demons, and that is these ladies here. These
are the demonettes.
The demonettes, you know. These are probably, I actually think these would be the scariest ones to face.
Yes.
Just because
those hands, they suggest they've got the touch of the
crabs go about them, really. So
Yeah. They do. They are a bit crabby, aren't they?
yeah,
But my main worry about facing the likes of a lesser demon, like the demonettes, is you know that they would be seducing you whilst killing you as well, and that's quite. I find that quite terrifying. You know, it's very.
I kind of like it.
It's very Bond girl. You know.
It is. It is. Yeah, it's they're not particularly attractive. They wouldn't be my type normally.
No, but
But
the thing is, you don't know what power they would have over you. You don't know if you would actually even see this.
yes,
You know, you might be looking at something that's completely different. It's a bit like in Red Dwarf when that creature, the metamorphosis creature thing,
Yes.
comes on board and it's a big gelatinous blob.
yeah,
But what you see is a beautiful woman or Kachansky or
yeah.
you know. So you might not even see what you're actually facing. So that's what I find a little bit terrifying.
And what's the relationship of Slaanesh like with the other gods? Is there any allegiances or alliances or
Probably the one that they would be closest to would be, although I wouldn't say close, but it would probably be Slaanesh
yeah,
would probably be the closest. They don't like Nurgle for obvious reasons. One is all about
pleasure,
and purity and pure feeling and indulgence.
Yeah.
And the other is about just dirty, rotten
yeah,
decay. You know, so they don't really align. I don't know that there's any extreme hatred
yeah,
between them, but I know they don't particularly get on. They've got nothing to chat about at a party.
yeah.
You know, sort of thing. So that's kind of.
And what about corn and I think there's no major ructions there like you would have had between Tzeentch and Khorne potentially.
No, although again, I don't know that they're that fond of each other.
Yeah.
I don't think Khorne's particularly fond of anyone.
Yeah, well, I can imagine. Yeah.
You know, but certainly I don't know. I think there's still he would see these. Khorne would see the Slaanesh as kind of unhonorable and kind of missing the whole point of combat. You know, whereas they have a very different opinion. So this is just a couple of pictures. I thought I would show these. This is a Fiend of Slaanesh.
Mm-hmm. That's the big purple guy.
That's the big purple guy. And then this is also a champion of Slaanesh riding on a Fiend too.
Yeah.
Different shapes.
Yeah.
But you can kind of see, you know, the similarities. You know, the Slaanesh seem to have weird long tongues.
I wonder why.
I don't know what that's about, but you know, I'm sure again the crabs are around.
Yep. I can see that in the claws. So there's a definite theme running through all of this.
But Slaanesh seem to have more in the way of kind of mounts. So the likes of the Fiend of Slaanesh, they also have chariots and things, which the demonettes ride. So they're kind of they like that kind of beast. Mm-hmm. You know, there's kind of there's quite a strong theme with the beast.
Yeah.
You know, the Fiend of Slaanesh as well.
Never worry. I'm having a look at this mount, and I'm noticing all sorts of appendages on this thing.
Yeah, and even on
the other one.
Yeah.
It's it's quite an exotic sculpt actually. No,
basically, you can't put these pictures up on Pinterest.
No. So
you need to put some red tape.
And are these greater demons, or what's their classification?
Well, these are kind of demonic beasts. So they're maybe not as intelligent as the likes of the demonettes. They might not have just as much freedom of thought. However, they're very much utilized by Slaanesh. If we move up the scale, then we have the big girl herself. She is the Keeper of Secrets.
The Keeper of Secrets.
So much in the same way as all the other gods have their greater demons, the Bloodthirster, the Great Unclean One, and the Lord of Change. The Keeper of Secrets is the manifestation.
This is the closest we have to a manifestation of Slaanesh.
Now, interestingly, although this model is, I suppose, in a way, kind of probably a lot more appealing than the others in terms of, you know, aesthetic.
Yeah.
You know, there's very obviously a very kind of woman's body type look to it. That's not necessarily always the case with Slaanesh. Sometimes the greater demons actually take the form of kind of quite ugly things. But that's because their perfection and their pleasure is gained from other things. So it's not always about the kind of sexual desire. It can be about the desire for perfection in terms of the mastering combat. It can be about, you know, gaining pleasure through pain, all those kind of things. So it doesn't always have to necessarily revolve around.
So it's pleasure in its purest form, and whenever you're, you know, looking at it from the perspective of a god, you know, what they perceive as pleasure and what we would perceive as pleasure could be very different things. So it could be quite unexpected. So if you wanted to, you could model or convert something like this for in other interesting ways, as long as you can find a way of kind of manipulate it into that pleasure vibe of some sort.
Yeah.
So
what's interesting and what's been discussed at length since Age of Sigmar has come out, is that they kind of, GW tried to move away from Slaanesh. They kind of put Slaanesh into quite a backroom sort of position within the lore. So they don't necessarily push the model range in any great strength for the Age of Sigmar, because Slaanesh kind of got a raw deal out of all the Chaos Gods in Age of Sigmar. So there's kind of been talk about...
Is this them looking at means of getting rid of the sexual aspect
I think
range?
so, yeah. I think so, and you can certainly see that with you know, the extent of you know, boobies.
Yes.
In the 90s we had a lot of boobies. In the noughties we kind of got less and less, and recently we've not had as many sort of obviously just because, you know, it's GW's policy.
Yeah.
To kind of move
I don't
away
know
from
I don't know where I fit on this, because part of me doesn't like to see the unnecessary sexualization of games and of miniatures and things like that. You know, I look at armored bikinis and things like that, and I just kind of shake my head these days. But at the same time, Slaanesh is a very purposeful manifestation of the pleasure. There is a very definitive narrative and fictional reason for it to be there. And while I can understand them censoring that to a degree, because, you know, obviously they want to reach the widest audience and they want as little hassle as possible. At the same time, I think for us, and adults that immerse ourselves in this game, it would be, I feel a sense of loss. You know, it's almost like if you took the sexualization out of Game of Thrones, you kind of lose the power of Game of Thrones and the fact that, you know, it is driven by, you know, desires and incestuous relationships and things like that there. And it's the same here. I think if it's taken out, it's a component that, although we may not know an awful lot about it, it is a component upon which, you know, in one of the major races it was created upon.
Well, I think what's interesting as well is that when we even particularly in this model, even though there's kind of exposed body parts, they're not sexy. You know, they're not sexualized. They're just there. You know, this isn't necessarily a woman that you'd want to meet on a night out, for example. So, you know, in that way, I kind of understand. Taste is an awkward thing. It's a difficult one.
Taste is a very personal thing, and you know, and you know, it's not up to me to dictate somebody else's taste. But at the same time, I like freedom of expression, and I like to defend freedom of expression and things like that. I think if we live in a world that becomes too sterile, we go down a dangerous path there, you know. And
So yeah, I'm very much of the defense of this kind of thing because it is core. It's not gratuitous.
No.
It's core to the underlying structure and story.
And it's a great model.
It is a superb model.
You know,
it is a superb model.
It's just it is you know.
So rather than see them reduce this, I would rather that it stayed there, but alternatives.
Yeah.
Other alternatives of the manifestations of Slaanesh would be my preference to see other things. But like I said, you could, in theory, have the pleasure of flight, or have the pleasure of the perfect blade, or there's lots of different ways. If you use your creativity, you could manifest that.
Definitely. So that kind of covers the demons, the demonic side of it, and then we kind of take a look at their sort of cult troops. And personally, I think these guys are fantastic.
Now, who are we looking at? The guys in the purple.
The guys in the purple, they are the Emperor's children. They were a legion, again, another one of the fallen legions.
So this is 30K again that we're looking at.
Again, we're looking at 30K. Yeah.
And is this then manifested in 40K then?
That is then manifested in 40K.
Yeah, masticated. Whatever that word is.
Masticated.
You're getting very Slaanesh here. So, right. Tell me, I'm very interested in the Emperor's children. I recognize these guys. Are these guys the Noise Marines?
These are the Noise Marines. Yeah.
Well, tell me about them in a minute.
Yeah.
But start with the Emperor's children, because I'm enjoying hearing the background to the fall of these legions. So.
The Emperor's children are a particularly interesting legion. They started off as probably one of the purest legions.
Well, the fact they're called the Emperor's children, you would have imagined that they would have been as close to the Emperor. Who was their Primarch?
Their Primarch was Fulgrim. And Fulgrim was... I'll talk about him in just a minute.
Yeah.
But I'll just talk about just before we meet Fulgrim. The Emperor's children were created again on Earth. Their gene seed was much in the same way that, as last week we were talking about the Thousand Sons. They were kind of created on Earth. They didn't have any problems. The Thousand Sons had a lot of problems with their gene seed and how they were created. The Emperor's children actually didn't have very many problems at all. There was kind of initially a kind of quite an early death rate. They died quite early of natural causes, which was unusual for Space Marines. But as they kind of grew up and they eventually got round to meeting their Primarch Fulgrim, and that's this guy here, they actually that sort of disappeared.
Fulgrim is magnificent, isn't he?
He's a brilliant model.
Now, I think I remember reading in the Horus Heresy that Fulgrim was a very magnificent character, and and to behold him was almost like beholding a demigod. He was very, very ornate and stuff like that, and you can definitely see that.
Yeah, I mean, model. He was, I suppose, lithe. Is lithe a good word? He's very, very trim and properly, had a good stance. Was the ultimate practiced warrior. He believed in perfection. And his legion were very much his legion actually on Earth. They came from kind of Highborn of Terra. So it was a part of Terra that had been taken over, and the sort of aristocracy provided their sons to the Emperor, and he used them for the Emperor's children. So the stock, they were quite almost aloof, kind of highborn kind of men, and they strived for perfection. They kind of existed in that kind of world of dueling and kind of martial and honorable combat.
It's a real aristocrat kind of feel to them. Yeah.
The Fulgrim.
It's funny that the aristocrats would end up in Slaanesh, but that's a story for another time.
So there was always this feeling of wanting to attain perfection, and Fulgrim was a lover of art. Whenever the Great Crusade was handed over to Horus, in actual fact, the Emperor sent out these kind of envoys from Earth, and they were called remembrancers. And the remembrancers' kind of role was to kind of note down all the great happenings of the Great Crusade. So kind
So
of
like documentary makers.
yeah, kind of like journalists and things like that there. But they kind of were multi-talented. So some of them were artists, some of them were poets. There was sort of troubadours and singers and.
I see. So the Great Crusade was documented in all of the most spectacular and artistic ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and great treaties were written about it and things like that there. And Fulgrim, a lot of the legions didn't like this. They sort of thought, we have to bring around these, you know, simple humans who are going to ask us lots of questions.
Getting under our feet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas Fulgrim kind of embraced it. He quite liked the idea. So much so that he actually got one of the remembrancers to immortalize him in stone. He wanted a massive statue of himself made. And this remembrancer kind of followed him around and talked to him, and as she was doing it, she started to create this artwork. But what happened was Fulgrim was slowly being tainted. This desire for perfection had started to get to the point where he was starting to taint. He'd been influenced by his brother, by the likes of Erebus, from the Word Bearers, who was really kind of the herald of the heresy. You know, he was kind of going through the legions, spreading dirt. You know, he said this about you, and you said, you know.
It's almost that insatiable appetite of a narcissist, really.
Yeah.
Where that sense of exuding power, exuding perfection, you became a fault rather than a positive within his character.
And he started then to seek out the excess of perfection and started to indulge in pleasure. So much so that the remembrancer, as she was creating the artwork, realized it was never going to be perfect enough. And as she created it, he then decided that he could do a better job. And he started to take over the creation of this
edifice. Almost,
Although what happened was, to her eyes, it was becoming more grotesque, but to his eyes, it was becoming more pure and more perfect and wonderful. And he ended up actually sort of sacrificing her on this edifice, and it was her blood and her sort of entrails that made it perfect. You know, so
that's really dark stuff.
Really dark stuff. The book Fulgrim, if you ever get a chance to read it, it's brilliant. You know,
I actually have it on my bedside table.
And it explores this, and
I haven't picked it up yet.
It's really interesting read because it really looks at these kind of remembrancers as well, and you know, really just is quite interesting to look at. So that was kind of how Fulgrim changed.
Now, is Fulgrim still around? Did he become
Fulgrim became a demon prince?
A demon prince. Was there ever a model or anything for him?
Again, we haven't seen the Fulgrim model as a demon prince. I hope one day that'll happen. That would be amazing. You know, now that we're starting to see things like Imperial Knights and things like that there, surely I think one day we might see these guys come to fruition. It'd be great.
It'd be awesome, wouldn't it?
TW, if you're listening. So getting back to our troopers. So obviously within the Legion, they were starting to succumb to this too, because obviously they followed their Primarch. They loved their Primarch. So we started to see this from them too. In fact, they started to have mass kind of sacrifices of kind of these remembrancers and things like that there, and they actually got into such a mad craze, sort of whipped up a mass fury, that actually what happened is they even created a warp rift, and demons spilled out onto Fulgrim's flagship and actually began a mass sort of killing of all non-Legion personnel aboard this flagship.
Right.
So they were really kind of getting very engrossed. So much so that whenever they got to the Siege of Terra, they didn't actually bother fighting the legions, the loyalist legions. They actually ended up fighting. Just slaughtering the population of Terra. Massive parts of the population of Terra were just sort of killed in this sort of mass
Frenzy. Yeah.
Of kind of massacre, essentially.
So they never even got involved in the battle. They just loved
not
killing and
no.
destruction and all the excesses
Excess, just enjoying that excess. At the same time, there was a character called Fabius Bile, and Fabius Bile is kind of the kind of arch apothecary. So he was kind of in charge of gene seed and all that kind of stuff. To the point where he was kind of almost became the kind of Dr. Mengele character. He was kind of experimenting on all of these prisoners that he had access to because his legion were just decimating the imperial kind of populace. So he was experimenting on people. He was taking the essence of each human, reducing it down into a kind of essentially a pill or a powder, and feeding it to the Marines, who were then kind of had all the energy from that person and were kind of exploding in this massive kind of rage because they'd had so much energy, and it was like a Red Bull times a million, So he's an interesting character as well. But one of the characters I want to have a look at is Lucius the Eternal.
Yeah.
Lucius was probably one of the greatest sword masters within the Emperor's Children. And so much so that he was always picking fights.
Yeah.
He picked a fight with one of the Lunar Wolves, who was having a wee fight, duel, and punched him. And Lucius was so driven by his desire to use the sword that he never thought that he could be beaten by a punch. And that's how he, they then had a rematch. He had a rematch with the Loken. And he actually kind of bested Loken the second time because he had learnt from his mistakes from the first time. However, he was constantly going around the galaxy, particularly during the Horus Heresy. Lucius Eternal was kind of traveling around, picking fights, and I eventually picked a fight with the wrong guy, and he got killed.
And who was that?
The name escapes me. It was it Saul Tarvitz? I think, I'm sure you'll correct me, but I think it was Saul Tarvitz.
I remember Saul Tarvitz, yeah.
I think it was him. And he killed him. However, he was brought back to life by Fabius Bile. And then he continued on his quest. Because he'd been beaten, he now wanted to find the next battle to be able to win.
To redeem himself.
Later on then, after the heresy, he came up against another character, another sparring champion. And again, he was killed. However, what happened was the Slaanesh recognized how good a warrior Lucius was and realized that he shouldn't have died. So what happened was this character that defeated Lucius actually started to lose his hair, and then his skin started to flake off.
Lucius wasn't inside him, was he?
And Lucius emerged.
Oh!
And as you can see on the armor, there are lots of faces.
Yes. What's that all about?
What happens is the person that Lucius overtakes or kind of possesses, then their soul is transcribed into the armor. So as you can see, he's been killed lots of times.
Yes.
But because he's Lucius the Eternal, he always sort of emerges from the person that's beat him. So he kind of...
And then they get absorbed into the armor. And
he absorbs their kind of power. So he's a really interesting character. Unfortunately, sometimes as happens in 40K, the rules don't quite match up.
Yeah.
Just because it's a big game, and you know, unfortunately, points wise, he's probably not as efficient. He's a great character to use.
Yeah.
It's a tremendous model. I really love this model. I think it's class. But you know, hopefully, we'll get rules that kind of fit him. You know, and kind of work a wee bit more with them. But yeah, he's a really cool character, really cool backstory.
Well, now comes to the part that I'm on fire about. If I want to recreate the Slaanesh experience on the tabletop, what option would you suggest for the creation of a Slaaneshi list, basically? What I need to be looking at?
Well, basically, I mean, a good starting point is the Chaos Codex and the and also the Chaos Demon Codex. They've got fantastic units in both. The Chaos Codex has the Slaanesh Noise Marines, and the Noise Marines are okay. They're probably a wee bit expensive, but they have some amazing rules. They have
Bring up the Noise Marines there for a second, because I want to talk about these guys. Now, if I remember, they had old models where they had guitars and saxophones and all sorts of stuff.
It's a pretty. I think I could be wrong, but up until recently, I know that GW used to kind of still sell some of the older models with the guitars and the amplifiers on the on the backpacks and stuff.
What is a Noise Marine then? Because I've always been. There are some things in the Chaos that I look at and I think that is utterly naff. That is utterly naff. And seeing Marines run around with guitars and amplifiers and stuff like that was probably absolutely on my put it in the bin list. You know, it's like it's naff. But what is the whole premise of a Noise Marine, or what are they?
Yeah, so the Noise Marines, they kind of get their pleasure from the noise. You know, so they really enjoy the noise.
You're telling me like they like the metal.
They like the metal. If we were to hear it, we wouldn't like the noise because it would make our head pop and stuff like that there.
Oh, okay.
But they this kind of weird cacophony of tunes, and the music that they like is probably somewhere in the region of when my dad says to me, "Oh, Lou, listen to that old rubbish you're listening to." Probably in that kind of realm. That's not even music. You know?
So you tell me it's like an episode of the X Factor then, is it? You know, it's
essentially, yeah. I think that's the modern equivalent, you know. When they hit that high C, you know, it's kind of, but basically, the Noise Marines, they produce a sound through their weapons that kind of, that just kind of blows up heads, and they use those frequencies that can shatter glass and those kind of things. So that's what they kind of enjoy. Doing. They actually, during the heresy, the Fabius Bile was the guy that kind of started to set around creating the idea of the Noise Marines. I think the Noise Marines are actually really terrifying. The idea of them, this premise of kind of it's like when you go and see a horror film, and there's always that noise, that sound that is. Without the sound, the image would be...
It's that low-frequency rumble,
you know,
that gets you right there and puts you on edge.
Yeah.
But it kind of hammers home to me one of the things that, you know, that we'll be uncovering, I'm sure, with the whole introduction of 30K into the product range is, you know, this is really, really cool. Yeah. Okay, the old Legion stuff is really, really cool. For me, not so much. Not so much. You know,
I think those guys, I think they do need a bit of an update.
They're a little bit dated.
They are a little bit dated, but I've certainly seen some of the GW artwork. I'll maybe throw it up on the forum.
Yeah.
Or the comments below. Some of the old artwork from certainly the 4th edition Codex. It was really terrifying. You know, this idea of a distended maw.
Yeah,
you know, something akin to the kind of the Grudge. You know, this deep maw,
the noise,
and the noise is and there's inside there's speakers and things like that there. For me, that is quite a terrifying idea.
In fact, now when you put it like that, I wonder, you know, what it must be like to be on the battlefield facing these, and you can hear the noise, or more importantly, you can feel the noise,
and your guts are.
Yeah, it's like a brown note.
Yeah.
You know? So, yeah.
Definitely, you know, I think, you know, it goes from that, though, it must go from a really deep sound to a frighteningly high pitch, kind of your ears are bleeding and real kind of real pain. So I think it'd be a truly terrifying experience.
So they have to make it into a Slaaneshi list then, yeah?
Definitely, it's all about the Noise Marines. I actually think they're a really cool unit. I actually really like them.
Yeah.
And honestly, what I would do with these guys if I was creating a Slaanesh list is I would just take these guys in rhinos.
Yeah.
And just
trundle them around.
Trundle them along. Plenty of those guys, and then I'd take our Fabius Bile. I think
now
Fabius,
this is a data slate. Now this is the first time I've seen the data slate. So this is an electronic only expansion of what, the Chaos book or
I mean essentially Fabius Bile's rules are in the Chaos Space Marine Codex. But this is kind of just a kind of extension of that. It goes into a wee bit more detail about his fluff and stuff like that there. So it's not necessary if you want to play Chaos Space Marines to pick up this sort of data slate as well. But it does contain just a few wee interesting quirks and. So
it does. It's not just fluff. It has additional rules. And
I think it has the data slates. Certainly the Karn the Betrayer one as well. Contains a formation that you can use with them.
Yeah.
Which we looked at. That was the Butcher Horde, Murder Fist Hand, kind of blood death thing.
Yep.
And this guy, he kind of has his own unit of like clones. He was mad into clones. In fact, so much so that he cloned Fulgrim. Was the first Primarch to slay another Primarch. He was the first brother to kill one of his brothers.
Who did he kill?
He killed Ferrus Manus.
Who was the Primarch
of the Iron Hands.
Right.
He tried to get him to turn. They were really good friends. And he tried to get him to turn to Chaos to follow him, and he wouldn't do it, and he slayed his brother. What happened then is Fulgrim actually got Fabius Bile to clone Ferrus Manus because he felt so guilty about killing his brother. He wanted to bring him back. And once he'd brought him back, he tried to convince the clone. But because the clone was so much like Ferrus Manus, he turned down the offer and Fulgrim had to kill him again. And this happened several times before Fabius realized this ain't gonna work.
It's not gonna work.
So Fabius Bile loves cloning things, and he has his own type of unit that is like essentially his clone troopers.
Yeah,
and they're pretty cool and they're kind of fearless and stuff like that there. So they're worth checking out, you know.
So if we were picking books, Chaos Space Marines, Fabius Bile Data Slate, and maybe the Demon book, so as you can get some of the pink horrors and screamers and things like that in there.
What I'm really hoping is that we see, much like we've seen with the Demonkin for the Khorne, is that we see that kind of same thing replicated for the other gods. It'd be really nice to see it, especially for Slaanesh and Sneech, because we haven't seen much for them.
Yeah.
Certainly a lot of the models are kind of quite dated.
The difficulty we have with Slaanesh is if there is this feeling now of them running down that particular aspect of it, we may never see it, which would be a real pity now.
But I think the Noise Marines are kind of, I think they would be fairly solid. I don't think we would see them disappear. We might see Slaanesh maybe move away, but maybe that Emperor's Children thing I think is so good that we'd never lose the Emperor's Children.
So describe the list then to me just once more, so as I can get it in my head.
So what I would have is probably Fabius Bile up front. Maybe a unit of his sort of special chosen clone warriors. Just kind of to make a real solid kind of like they're not going anywhere. They're fearless and things like that there. And then I would just have lots of squads of Noise Marines.
All in Rhinos.
So maybe 3 squads of those guys. Again, the Sonic Blasters and things like that there ignore cover. So it's amazing to have ignore cover in 40K. Because particularly in these days, there's so much cover around.
And you can bring your own terrain and stuff.
You can bring your own terrain.
Whereas this can...
Exactly. So I would take those guys. I know they're expensive, but they're
fun to play.
And they're very versatile.
Yeah.
And then I would probably look down the likes of the demonettes.
Yeah.
Particularly the demonettes on fiends and things like that there, because they're really fast and they give you that edge, kind of combat stuff like that there.
Well, there you have it. That's Slaanesh. Before we go, I want to round off or talk about the Chaos God. You had mentioned a fifth god at the start of this whole process. So, just to recap, do we know anything more about him? He's called Malice?
Malice, or Malal, he kind of had sort of this weird phase where he went through both names. Really, there's not a whole lot to know about him. We know that he's the god of kind of anarchy, and he likes to wind up the other gods. There are potentially, kind of cultists existing around there, or out and about, who kind of follow him. But he's never really, since kind of after sort of first edition, the Rogue Trader era, he didn't really stay in the canon to an extent.
So if we wanted to create the Mark of Malice, we'd have to kind of homebrew that a little bit.
I think we'd have to homebrew it, yeah. There are kind of references to him here and there. They're very sort of basic. So if anyone has any insight into that, that'd be great.
I would love to hear more
that'd be great to
about
find out.
Malice if you know about it. The old one. What you made a passing reference a few weeks back to the old ones. Are these gods that existed before the Chaos gods, or what are the old ones?
We don't know a huge amount about the old ones because they disappeared from the galaxy. We don't know if they were destroyed, or how they sort of disappeared. A whole lot. There's kind of lots of links with them in the Necrons. But basically, they were a race, essentially a race almost of demigods in their own right. And when they were around, they kind of had a hand in creating the races that we know. They also existed in the Warhammer world as well, way back with fantasy. They were much more prevalent in fantasy. They kind of they created the Slann. They kind of give the power, of kind of life to the humans and things like that there. But then we're told that they had to, kind of leave that dimension and go to another dimension. They were interdimensional travelers. They had a fight with the Necrons, and originally the Necrons were almost were living beings. They were almost humanoid, but to help them kind of defeat the old ones, the trickster god, one of the Kaitans, the deceiver, he actually tricked the.
Now, are the Catan part of this warp business as well, or are they a different breed of god?
The Catan actually don't exist anywhere in the warp.
So
they're kind of weird. They are sort of demigods in their own kind of right, but they don't exist in the warp. So they're not a chaos god. They're kind of something else. Somewhat in the same way as the Eldar gods.
Like the Avatar,
like Cain. And Nurgle's friend Isha. They were kind of existed, although they existed within the warp because they had sort of psychic presence. Things like that there. Interestingly, we don't know the one race that doesn't have any psychic leaning at all is the Tau. So that's why kind of they're very much expansionist and they're very kind of pure in that way. They don't actually have any real psychic
connection.
What the Imperials would call blunt. When you're blunt, you don't have any psychic power. Which makes their rate of expansion, although very quick in their own sort of way, they don't have access to the warp in the same way, so they can't navigate it. So that's sort of what contains them in their part of the galaxy. The orcs have a massive psychic presence because every orc is essentially part of a larger psychic ability. And that's why their gods of Gork and Mork are quite real manifestations sometimes on the battlefield. So yeah, I mean, looking at the old ones, they kind of were almost the creators of the races that we know. You know, kind of, or were certainly around in the very early days of their creation.
Yeah.
So we don't know how big their influence was, but it certainly was. They certainly had an influence.
Yeah.
Upon the creation.
Okay. Well, that wraps up our look at the Chaos Gods. Where we go from here, we don't know. It'll be down to you guys probably to decide. We have some ideas of where we go next, and if you want to find out, well, then tune in next week. In the meantime, tell us about your Slaanesh stories. No, actually don't. Sorry, scrap that. Tell us about what you know of Slaanesh.
Within the confines of 40K.
Yeah, within the confines of 40K. And we'll definitely be active in the comments with you there to learn more about it. AJ, thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
And as always, guys, thank you for watching. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Right, so we have a few links up to help you out. Check out the playlist. We also have a subscribe option. And remember, if you subscribe, to click the bell to ding our dong. Finally, if you're into binge watching and you want a whole lot more 40K Charted, come on over to beastsofwar.com, join Backstage, and you get early access to all of the seasons.